Well, good afternoon, evening. It's sort of somewhere between the two, isn't it? Very lovely to have those of you who are here today joining us, and a wave to those online as well. Really glad that you could be with us too for this 10th lecture. Storytelling lecture, so it makes it sound ever so academic. It is, of course, very clever. Now, I have to tell you, Barbara's already done one of these today because she very kindly came earlier so that we could record last week's. So if you want a recap of last week's stories, then you'll be able to pick them up on our website within 24 hours or so, once I've uploaded them. But without further ado, I want to welcome Barbara back and invite her to take us through session 10.
Thank you.
I'll let you introduce it.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, near and far. We left last week's story absolutely on a cliffhanger. In the middle of King Saul's decline, as he became more and more paranoid in his fear of David's hidden ambition, which it seemed that only he could perceive. David's popularity was universal, it seemed, not only with the people, but even with his own son, Jonathan, and his daughter, Michal, both of whom loved David dearly in spite of their father. They couldn't believe that their father would really kill David. But David at last realized that his life was very probably in danger. Indeed, his wife Michal knew of the danger and saved him one night. She let him down from the window of their bedroom and placed a dummy with a wig of goat's hair in his bed just before the soldiers arrived to get him. David quickly went into hiding, but he secretly met Jonathan, and they planned to find out for certain what Saul's intentions were. David decided he would be absent from the 3-day moon festival and asked Jonathan to watch whether Saul even noticed. If he did, Jonathan was to tell his father that David had gone back to Bethlehem to keep a yearly feast with his own family. And if Saul accepted that without worrying, they would know that David's fears were negligible. But that if Saul reacted with anger, Jonathan would realize the seriousness of the situation. And he would get a secret message to David to tell him to escape. At the feast, it all happened, and Saul was angry. Afterwards, Jonathan set out to warn David. They'd arranged how to do it, so Jonathan went to the appointed field where David was hiding and shot some arrows into the far distance. And he told a young lad to go and retrieve the arrows and shouted to him, "Go further, they are beyond you." And Jonathan sent the boy away and met David. They embraced, wept, and swore perpetual loyalty to each other before parting. Then Jonathan went back home, and David became a fugitive, never knowing where he was truly safe. He went from place to place, in one holy place even eating the sacred bread, and acquiring the sword of Goliath from the priest of Ahimelech in Nob, which sadly was witnessed by a man called Doeg, and more of him later. David, from his fugitiveness, gave up and became a refugee, living in a cave known as Adullam. There we are. This was in the land of Moab. And when news of his whereabouts gradually became known, David was joined by many other fugitives and outlaws and became their captain, a bit like Robin Hood at this stage. Saul heard of David's escape, thanks to Doeg, who had seen him with Ahimelech in Nob. And Saul summoned Ahimelech to the presence to explain himself. And Saul was angry after listening to him and ordered his guards to kill Ahimelech and all his family. But his guards refused to kill any priests of Yahweh. So Saul commanded Doeg, the Edomite, to kill them, and then go and destroy all the priests and their families and possessions in Nob. He was paranoid. But Doeg obeyed. And only one man managed to escape the massacre. He was Abiathar, one of Ahimelech's sons. He fled to join David, who welcomed him into his gang to keep him safe from Saul. At another time, David had a narrow escape when he heard of a Philistine mob attacking and stealing grain from the Judean people of Keilah, and went to help them. Saul heard and thought he'd get David while he was in a town with gates and bars. But he failed again on arrival, only to hear that David had disappeared again. This time he went to Horish in the wilderness of Ziph. And a secret meeting took place between David and Jonathan. Jonathan assured David of his loyal friendship, even though he realized that David, rather than himself, would probably become the next king. His promise was sealed with a solemn covenant between them. Then they parted, and that for the last time. Saul continued to pursue David, was on the point of capturing him in the wilderness of Maon when news came of another Philistine attack, and that, of course, took priority. And he hurried away, leaving David alive to escape again, this time to En-Gedi. And Saul eventually returned to the hunt, and now we have two parallel stories to delight us in this cat-and-mouse style hunt. The next picture is of En-Gedi. Any name in that area that begins Ein, E-I-N, says there is a natural spring there, so there's a certain amount of vegetation, but probably in the sort of rocky scenery that you see here. This is En-Gedi. I saw other photographs of the spring, but I thought this was much more indicative of the sort of terrain in which the cat and mouse game was pursued. The first of these stories centered around En-Gedi, a rugged, sparsely populated area full of rocks and caves. Saul entered one of them to rest, totally unaware that David was in the same cave, but much further in and within his grasp. But he didn't notice. While he slept, David crept up, didn't kill Saul, because it's always a bad precedent to set for a would-be assassin, in case the same thing happened to him in due course. So instead of killing Saul, David daringly cut off a piece of his cloak. And when the next day came and Saul went on his way, David followed him, emerging later from the cave. He eventually called to Saul, who turned, and he heard how David could have killed him, but didn't. He believed him when he saw David holding the corner of his cloak. David again swore his loyalty to Saul, the anointed king, and there was a grand reunion between them. Saul accepted in his heart that David would become the next king and merely begged him not to harm any of his family. They parted friends, but David did not go home with him. There was peace for a little while, but I'm afraid it didn't last. Saul had taken David's wife, his daughter Michal, and married her to someone else soon after David had disappeared. David acquired 2 more wives, Abigail and Ahinoam. And then we find an announcement. Samuel, the old prophet, had died and was buried at Ramah, which was his hometown. The next story is very similar. It's situated in the wilderness of Ziph. I'm afraid I haven't any programs of Ziph, any pictures of Ziph. David was living there, but it was similar to Ein Gedi. Saul's feeling of despair had intensified after Samuel's death, and when he was alerted to David's whereabouts, he set off again to kill him. This time, David sent out spies to find out where Saul had made camp. Then one night he and one trusted companion, Joab, crept right into Saul's camp while everyone was fast asleep. This time, David stole Saul's spear, which lay beside him, together with a water jar, before making a very hasty retreat. Next morning, from a safe distance, David called Saul's commander, Abner, and taunted him for sleeping while leaving his master unguarded, when he could so easily have been killed by his own spear, which was no longer beside Saul, so they found. As David was challenging him, Saul heard and recognized David's voice. David protested his innocence, and Saul realized again that David had no evil intentions against him and was filled with remorse for his actions. He himself said, and I quote, "Come back, my son, David, for I will never harm you again. I've been a fool and have made a big mistake." David, however, did not go back, knowing how volatile Saul's hostility could be. He returned Saul's spear when one of Saul's men came to retrieve it, and then realized he could only get totally beyond Saul's reach if he and his men went to live among the Philistines. And he did just that. There's a map on the screen. I don't know how clearly you can see it, but towards the left there's Philistia, which is the Philistine stronghold, and it's the Gaza Strip nowadays, and what we call Gaza was then called Gath. And that is towards the southern end of Philistia, and almost opposite on the eastern side is Ziklag. They are both considerably further south than Hebron and Jerusalem and all the towns that we usually hear about as the Israelites' territory. So David was in Ziklag. We're going to, he went to King Achish of Gath to start with, and asked if he could have refuge in one of the country towns. And it was Achish who gave him permission to live at Ziklag. We're going to leave him there for a little while, for 16 months to be precise, living at Ziklag. Well, he carried out raids for booty, but always telling the Philistines that he was raiding Israelite territories. The Philistines believed him and thought they had nothing to worry about. But in following Saul's sad decline without Samuel's support, but still fearful of David's hidden ambition, which he alone seemed to perceive, we can either just follow the flow of the story as it is, written only a few years later by people who'd prospered and become literate during David's long reign when he was king, and for whom David was their hero. We can either do that, or we can sharpen our wits a little and strive to get a more balanced view of Saul even as he was in decline. Because David did not become king without a great deal of cunning and guile. In his absence, having defected to the Philistines, Saul quietly had regained much of his former respect and loyalty amongst the Israelites. He'd always been a soldier king. His troops remained loyal to him right up to the end of his reign. He lived modestly. He maintained Yahweh's law in Israel. And he'd done more to unite the Israelite tribes than any of the former leaders, the judges. And that could only be by bringing them all together religiously under the covenant bond and the law of Yahweh, especially when their victories, however small, were all attributed to him. David, by contrast, was a charismatic charmer, fearless, full of ambition, especially since his secret anointing by Samuel. And he's usually presented by his biographers as squeaky clean and a loyal follower of Yahweh. But it is right to question this. Was his faith genuine or politically motivated to improve his kingdom when he finally achieved it? This is a very fine line, and I'm well aware, and I'm stepping back now into the shoes of a person of faith, acknowledging that God can use all sorts of people, however good or bad, when he wants his own purposes to be furthered. So, I accept that. I'm stepping back now into history, and we're right to question David's motives. We have to remember he was also a great musician and a poet. And if he did write Psalm 23 himself, and there's no reason to think that he didn't, think of the words, Yahweh is my shepherd. That must have meant a great deal to one who grew up being a shepherd himself. It's also interesting to note, while pausing from the story in 1 Samuel, that occasionally significant differences appear between the old translation of stories in the King James Version of the Bible in 1611 and the most recent and more accurate version in the New RSV version in 1989. This, of course, is thanks to the discovery of lots more information, particularly the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in 1947. So we have a much better text now for modern scholars to work on. Now, back to Saul and to David. The Philistines again are preparing for yet another attack against the Israelites, and Saul was more dejected than ever. In his desperation for advice, he lapsed, and against all his loyalty to Yahweh, he sought the advice of a medium at Endor, sometimes in the old version called the Witch of Endor, but she was a medium, a spiritualist, fortune teller, foreteller of the future. And I have a picture. Oh, that was Ziklag, what remains of it. A picture of the medium at Endor with her classic bowl. It seems that she was only one of two that had survived all his attempts to purify his territories for Yahweh alone. But now Saul found himself abandoned by Yahweh and was desperate. He went in disguise with only two companions, and they went by night. But the medium was suspicious. Remember how tall, outstandingly tall, Saul was. But he promised her she would not be in trouble and asked her to call up the spirit of Samuel. So she performed all her rites and told Saul that she could see an old man coming up, wrapped in a robe. Immediately, Saul recognized him as Samuel. Please don't ask me how. But Saul made his obeisance and asked for advice. But Samuel refused, saying Yahweh had rejected Saul as king in Israel when he'd acted like other kings, holding each other in respect and not obeying Yahweh's command to kill King Agag long ago. He therefore forecast defeat and death for Saul and his sons in a battle that the Philistines were preparing for. Saul collapsed, terrified, on the floor, and he was suffering for lack of food. The medium herself had pity on him, prepared a meal, and fed him before he left, going out again into the night. Get rid of that. So when the Philistines prepared for battle, David prepared to go with them in service to his host, Achish of Gath. But it was the other Philistine commanders who objected, warning that in the midst of battle, David could defect to his own people. David had obviously worked his charm on Achish, who apologized to him, but sent him away. On his return to Ziklag, however, he found it burnt to the ground by marauding Amalekites. And most of the people, including David's 2 wives, Abigail and Ahinoam, were taken away captive. David immediately set off in pursuit. With the help of a stray Egyptian, he discovered where they were. And they attacked at twilight and successfully recovered all that had been taken from Ziklag, including David's wives. And then they had a triumphal return, and he shared all the booty they had taken from the Amalekites to all around in the neighborhood. The Philistines, meanwhile, carried out their attack on Mount Gilboa, a huge mountain running parallel with the River Jordan. A very, very high mountainous hill. The battle was fought. The Philistines had a massive victory. Saul's son Jonathan and one of his brothers were killed. Soon after, Saul himself was badly wounded by a group of archers. Brave soldier that he was, he begged his armor-bearer to kill him, rather than let him become sport for the enemy. When his armor-bearer couldn't bring himself to do it, Saul fell on his own sword and died. When his armor-bearer saw that, he did the same. Next day, the Philistines found his body, and it was mutilated by them in their victorious frenzy. Then they abandoned it, and his armor was placed in a temple of Astarte. A few days later, some very brave men retrieved the bodies of the Israelites, cremated them, and buried their ashes reverently under the tree in Jabesh. The Israelite tribes had suffered their greatest defeat ever, and had been crushed, while the Philistines ruled more territory than ever before. We'll have the Mount Gilboa again. In the meantime, David was oblivious of all the news until a man from the Amalekites arrived, dirty and in torn clothes, having escaped from the battle. David was devastated on hearing the news and asked how he knew. The Amalekite mistakenly thought he would benefit from his tale and embellished it, telling David that Saul himself had begged him to put him out of his misery, being mortally wounded. So he said, "I stood over him and killed him." And he'd then taken Saul's crown and royal armlet and brought them to David. But David was horrified. and did no more than order him to be killed, because he had killed Yahweh's anointed. We can guess, however, that he was quite pleased to take possession of the royal insignia. But there's still a long way to go, I'm afraid, for David's ambition to be fulfilled. To David's credit, however, listen to part of the incredibly beautiful poem he wrote in memory of Saul and Jonathan, to whom he owed so much. And years ago, I was travelling with a coach full of friends along the road parallel to Mount Gilboa, between the mountain and the river. And as we travelled along that road, our guide quietly began to recite the whole of this poem off by heart, and leaving us all very quiet for a while afterwards. And if you would like to read the whole poem for yourselves, it's in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 19 to 27. And here are a few verses from it. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Oh, how the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. David went to Hebron, the stronghold of Judah, his own tribe, where he heard of the noble actions of the people of Jabesh Gilead, how they treated Saul's remains with great respect. He promised to reward them. And it was there in Hebron, the heart of his own tribal area, that the people of Judah anointed David to be their king. And the Philistines were quite happy with this development, because they still regarded David as one of their own vassals. It was still another 7.5 years before the other Israelite tribes also made him their king. After the disastrous battle, Saul's commander-in-chief, Abner, who'd survived, went to find Saul's non-military son, Ishbosheth, who hadn't gone to the battlefield. And Abner made him king over all the other tribes. But Ishbosheth was a weakling. Real power was in the hands of Abner, the soldier. He had no love for David anymore. David, who'd humiliated him for allowing Saul's spear to be taken years before, when Saul could have been killed by David. The first struggle between them was a combat. That is, Abner and Ishbosheth's team and versus David and Joab's team, a contest of strength, which David's side won. But it continued personally between Abner and one of Joab's brothers, however, and resulted eventually in the death of Joab's brother. So there's no love lost left between Joab and Abner, both of whom were well-tested soldiers. Abner was saved this time by his own tribespeople, the Benjaminites. But the situation continued to deteriorate. King Ishbosheth was a weakling. And time went by. David remained in Hebron, and the first of his very many children were born there. And Abner grew stronger, to the detriment of any authority that Ishbosheth thought was his. Abner eventually had a big row with Ishbosheth who criticised him for abducting one of Saul's concubines. Because in those days, it was always the duty of a new king to look after the previous king's concubines, rather than to cast them out. Abner was angry and told Ishbosheth off for daring to criticise him. Abner then informed Ishbosheth that he was fed up. He was leaving and transferring his allegiance to David to support him to become king instead of Ishbosheth. And poor Ishbosheth was much too scared to argue with him. Abner sent messengers to David at Hebron offering his support, which David accepted, on condition that Abner brought his original wife Michal with him. And Abner did just that. He took her from her new husband, who followed her weeping all the way back to David. But Abner was greeted with enthusiasm, the ceremonial feast laid on for him, when he promised to persuade the other tribes to make David their king too. Abner went away very pleased with himself. But when Joab heard what had happened while he'd been away on a raid, he rebuked David for not killing him when he had such a good opportunity. He was very suspicious of Abner's real intentions. And without telling David, Joab sent soldiers to bring Abner back and killed him himself, officially because Abner had killed his brother, but also because he didn't trust Abner's motives in defecting to David. Squeaky clean David again ordered an honourable funeral for Abner and followed the bier himself before fasting for the rest of the day. It was not long after that Ishbosheth's courage failed, together with all the tribes whose king he was. It's this point that we hear that Jonathan had left a son who'd been badly crippled as a child, named Mephibosheth. But more of him later. Ishbosheth did not survive long. 2 visitors entered his palace and assassinated him in his bed. They beheaded his body and hurried to Hebron and presented the head to David, who again was horrified at the death of a righteous man. So the assassins were killed, and again an honourable funeral was given to the head of King Ishbosheth. And then it all happened peacefully. The leaders of all the tribes came to David saying that Yahweh wanted David to be king. King over all the tribes of Israel, at last. And David ruled all the tribes for another 33 years. And I'll tell you what happened then next time. Thank you for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's very much a cat and mouse story, I know, but it's the herald of what comes next. David, the king of the golden age. I hope to see you then. Thank you for coming today.
Well done, Barbara. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go home with Ishbosheth in my head. I just know it. Yeah. Some wonderful names, aren't they? They really are. All right. Well, thank you for once again helping us to get a handle on the complexity of that time and all this coming and going and all these tribes battling against each other. It's so helpful to have it told to us. It really is. Yes, I know, but you do it so helpfully, and we're very grateful to you. Thank you. And join us later this evening when Dr. Flapp will be leading tonight's Evensong on Zoom. And if you need to know how to get onto Zoom, then see me afterwards. And lots of other great stuff happening during the week. Check out the Corona Chronicle, copies on the table, or for those of you online, you know how to get it, I'm sure, from the parish website. But have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
And there are notes to pick up. Well, only one sheet of notes for today's programme, but I've put the ones the previous week, so if you missed any of them, do help yourself.
And the notes are also on the website. If you go to our website, go to study notes and then the Bible story, you'll be able to catch up with previous editions and the notes. So God bless you all. Take care.